Okay, we're back. We're talking about the 12 emotions that Aristotle discussed. We've discussed the first six there in pairs, you remember. We have fear and confidence as the first set, the first pair. Then we have friendship and enmity, and we have anger and calmness. I worked backwards there, but those six that we've discussed so far. We continue then with shame and kindness. That's an odd pairing right there. And so let me explain shame to you, and then I'll explain kind of how that contrasts with kindness. So I don't think it's a perfect contrast here, but nonetheless, we're examining what Aristotle discussed. Aristotle discussed these different emotions in order to teach you as a student how to produce this in an audience. And so there are times when it would be appropriate to produce shame, to seek to produce shame in an audience. And one of the things I've discussed in these lectures is that it's hard to produce in an audience an emotion that you don't feel yourself. But shame probably isn't always, it's not always necessary that you feel shame in order to produce shame. There are things we ought to be ashamed of, and sometimes an audience that ought to be ashamed. And sometimes it may be your calling to to make them feel that shame. And so it's important to understand how the emotion works so that you know how to produce it in your audience. So we start with shame. And Aristotle defines shame as a pain or disturbance in regard to bad things, whether present, past, or future, which seem likely to involve us in discredit. Okay, so the cause of the shame, and it can be any time frame, but the cause of the pain, this painful disturbance, is that I have been involved in something that brings disgrace on me. And I feel that disgrace as well. So that's the idea of shame right there. Shame is, it can be used and weaponized against people, and we see that all the time today in this culture. People weaponizing shame in order to cow people, in order to control people, or neutralize them. And so there, and you know, we could talk about cool shaming, because cool shaming is a real thing where you're embarrassed because, and you know, when you have the conventional opinions, the progressive opinions, the accepted opinions, and if you differ from those and what our culture is saying, then you get shamed for it. And that's what late night comedy shows are about as much as anything. They're not really funny anymore, but rather about shaming those who don't conform to cultural expectation and so on. There are things, and we talked about this in these lectures, that there are some things that sometimes that an emotion ought to be felt, and sometimes that an emotion should not be felt. And we always need to feel the appropriate emotion, and appropriateness is defined by Scripture. So if God says it's a shame, we should be ashamed of it. And one thing God says about the world is that they glory in their shame. So, and that's an interesting thing because you see it so vividly around us, the way people glory in their shame. They don't feel that they're brought into discredit by sins that are normalized, that are embraced, accepted, paraded, trumpeted in our culture. And so they glory in their shame. The Bible has a lot to say about things like shame. And shame shall be the promotion of fools is an example where people are embracing a lifestyle that is rebellious against God, contrary to God, and they glory in it and they get credit for it. I mean, when you'll see this as you grow older, if you are a college student, if you're an older person, you've seen it, and you're watching this. That when people leave a conservative church and come out as, they leave their King James only position and they're all of a sudden granted hero status for it, like they've done some really noble and brave deed, or they stop being a part of a conservative, reverent, worshiping church and move from there to a rock and roll kind of church, and then they're again paraded and applauded as if they did some noble, heroic thing. And this is what the Bible is talking about. The shame shall be the promotion of fools. That people are, when they go contrary to what they've been taught, sound doctrine, so on, they reject norms in the Christian faith, that becomes their promotion. That's what exalts them. That's what lifts them up. And then the same thing, we see that our culture, the Bible identifies several kinds of evil. There's just plain, ordinary evil, and but then there's a greater kind of evil, the kind of evil that calls evil things good and good things evil. And that sort of thing also is an example of where shame is turned up on its head. And so now people are embarrassed or ashamed that they're following Christ and obeying Him and reverent towards Him, rather than being ashamed. The people who are throwing off those things, they are not ashamed, and they ought to be. Paul talked about it in the church at Corinth, the fact that the people in the church at Corinth thought of themselves almost as if they were enlightened, that they were really progressive. Their church was really progressive because they had this man in the church who was cohabiting with his stepmother or his mother-in-law. And so the Bible is, and Paul rebuked them and said, you ought to be ashamed, but instead you think that this is making you something better, like a step above here. And so we see this kind of thing where shame gets turned up on its head. But there still is a right kind of shame, and shame is for a right purpose as well. Good shame, if we can say it that way. Shame is a painful emotion, but nonetheless, it's a good thing when it corrects us. And shame has a corrective power to it, and that's why God uses it, and that's why God speaks of it. But of course, we know that the conscience can be seared as with a hot iron. There is what has been called the whore's forehead, that the whorish woman that the Bible describes as eating her and wiping her mouth and saying, "What have I done? What was wrong with that? It's just a little fun, And so I think our culture calls it the oldest occupation, and that kind of thing that kind of exalts and glorifies what is shameful. Same thing with nakedness, nudity. The Bible says that Adam and his wife were naked and they were not ashamed. And of course, that was prior to sin. But when sin entered into the world, then they knew that they were naked and they were ashamed and hid themselves from God as well. Now, we live in a culture today that is not ashamed of nudity, not ashamed of nakedness, and puts it out in the open. I'm driving down the freeway and you'll see billboards with women that are scantily clad, and I always think, where's that woman's dad? Where is her husband to say, no, you don't want all the men driving down the freeway looking at you like that? But there's no shame. There's no shame. And it's a mark of the debased culture that we live in, that things that are naturally ashamed, virtuous people, are promoted today. So that's shame, the idea that it involves in discredit. Now, we feel shame at such bad things as we think are disgraceful to ourselves or to those we care for. So you can be embarrassed for someone that you love, if one of your parents is arrested, and if it's for anything other than a really virtuous, noble thing, you are likely to feel embarrassed about that and ashamed of it, especially and that's why, if you have a late bill and or something like that, and there's some way that it becomes known, it gets out in the open, or people see it, you'll be embarrassed by that, because we think that we should do right in those kinds of things, that we should do better in that. And so it brings us into discredit. We feel shame about that. These evils are those due to moral badness, or due to lacking a share in the honorable things shared by everyone else. So if you're not living up to expectations or standards, if you're trying to maintain a certain quality, moral quality in your life, and you have this failure, and then it becomes known, you feel ashamed of that. You've not lived up to expectations. Perhaps your expectations for yourself, perhaps what people around you in your community, at your church, probably plays a big factor in that, and what you would be embarrassed for people to know about you. That's shame. And then we feel shame before those whose opinion matters to us most. So that's why you would be more embarrassed for, say, your friends who know you but don't know you. Maybe someone at college that you really admire or look up to, if they found out about something, as opposed to, say, your family who already knows about it because they've known you for your whole life. That's why, sometimes in a home, there's a certain way that people talk to each other that can be harsh, nasty, etc. And you would never talk that way if you had guests in your home. You would always talk very kindly and nicely and sweetly in the presence of guests. But when the guests are gone, then you change your tone. It's because, and that, by the way, should indicate that the way that you're talking in the home is not right. It's not pleasing to God with that. Okay, so we feel shame, especially towards those who are not open to the same imputation as ourselves. So if you know, for instance, that a person is extremely careful with their money, has never paid a bill late, and then you pay one late and they find out about it, you're going to feel very ashamed, especially if that's something that's a big deal to them. So that's kind of an example of what I'm talking about. It's the reason why things that we do in secret that we don't want anyone to know about. If a guy's involved in pornography or something, he's not walking around telling everybody that he has this. It's his guilty pleasure. He hides it. He conceals it because he doesn't want people to know about it. Rightly so. It is something a man should be ashamed of, that he's degrading women that way in his mind, that he is using a woman's body for his own selfish pursuits. It's a wicked, debased kind of thing anyway, and it ought to be a shameful thing. Once in a while I see a car driving around and a guy will have a sign, a bumper sticker in his car that says, "I love pornography," or something like that. And I think that's a guy whose conscience is seared. And that's a guy who girls should stay away from. Unfortunately, well, anyway, I'm preaching enough here. The opposite of shame, according to Aristotle, was kindness. Now, we can dispute that. I don't know if we would naturally make that correlation there. However, our purpose in this lecture is simply to examine the thought of Aristotle. And Aristotle considered kindness the opposite of shame, or he treated the two as opposites of each other, corresponding but opposites. So he defined kindness this way. Kindness, he said, is helpfulness towards someone in need, not in return for anything, nor for the advantage of the helper himself, but for that of the person helped. Now, just examining, setting the two side by side, shame is pain or disturbance in regard to bad things that bring us into discredit. Kindness, helpfulness towards someone in need. Okay, so Shame brings me into discredit, or someone into discredit in the eyes of someone who we consider to be morally equal or superior to ourselves. Kindness is reaching out, helpfulness to someone who is in need. Okay, so lower than us. So shame is felt in an upward trajectory. Kindness is felt in a downward trajectory. Now, of course, if you're trying to produce shame, then you're trying to raise the specter of a high moral standard and hold it up to people so that they see themselves in that light and recognize the shame, feel the shame that they ought to feel. Kindness, though, is where you are trying to make people feel kindness towards you. We feel kindness when we see someone in need that we wish to help. Okay? So I see a need and I try to help. So shame, I see moral goodness, moral integrity, and I see that I don't measure up to it. Kindness, I see need. I see fallenness. I see urgency, and I feel kindly towards that person to help them. Okay, so think shame. I see, I know I just messed up. I just blew it, and I see over here this guy who's never blown it, or at least never blown it as far as I know, who I look at as a paragon of virtue, and I feel ashamed by that. And kindness, I see someone who's hurting and needs help, and I feel like helping them. So kindness is the opposite in the sense that there is sometimes a tendency, we see somebody who's in need, someone who's hurting, and we think, yeah, that's what they get. They deserve that. And perhaps it's a rival, and they got their comeuppance, and so we jeer at them, we sneer at them in that condition. Kindness, instead of jeering and sneering, despising, looking down on them, which is, by the way, when you feel shame, you feel that that person who's the paragon of virtue, that person is looking down on you, despising you. So that's why kindness is the opposite, because I'm seeing someone who's hurting, someone who's degraded perhaps. And instead of despising them, I feel kindly towards them. Okay, so the definition again, I didn't finish the definition before. The definition of kindness: kindness is helpfulness towards someone in need, not in return for anything, nor for the advantage of the helper himself, but for that of the person helped. Okay, so instead of despising him, I want to help him, and I want to help him not because it does anything for me, because it doesn't. I don't gain anything by it. I just help him for his own sake. Okay? And again, we feel kindness when we see someone in need that we wish to help. And again, just for his own sake. Okay? So then we believe people to be kind when they help us in times of need, and they do it not for self-promotion. So this is a problem with charity in our country quite often. It seems like every actor, that when they become famous, they start their own foundation, their own charity. Every famous sports figure, superstar, they start their own charity and their own foundation. And then they constantly promote it. And if you see anyone that they've helped, they're always paraded out as a way of promoting the person who helped them. That's not really kindness. I don't want to be the face of some charity. I don't want to be seen as a charity case. But when people have been truly kind to me, they're not bragging about it or boasting about it or telling other people what they did for me, but rather they did it. They did it for me, and they did it because they cared about me, because they wanted me to succeed. And those people made a difference in my life. And I feel kindness towards them, and I definitely feel that they've been kind towards me. Okay, so there's shame and kindness. Next, we have pity. Pity Aristotle said, is a feeling of pain caused by the sight of some evil, destructive, or some evil, it's a feeling of pain caused by the sight of some evil, whether destructive or painful, which befalls one who does not deserve it, and which we might expect to befall ourselves or some friend of ours, and moreover, to befall us soon. Okay, so you feel pity when, sometimes when just bad things happen, something that you would be crushed by, and you see it happen to somebody else, and you feel like they didn't deserve that, and so you feel pity for them. And the more you think that could be you, the more likely you are to feel pity towards them. So, sometimes a guy loses his job. Something happens at work, and he gets blamed for it, and you can see how easy that would be. You don't believe that he did something wrong there. He just took the fall for it, and it cost him his job, and he's unemployed for a little while, and you feel bad for him. That's pity. Now, pity, of course, pity can also be used as a tool of manipulation. It's used in our culture quite often, and guys and girls use it in different ways. Girls who are constantly bemoaning some health problem, or some, always having a health problem, and always talking about it, and just sickly and that sort of thing, and you feel bad for them all the time, and they use that pity sometimes to get something that they want, that they desire. Guys use pity also. I think that I would warn a young lady away from a guy who uses pity in order to get you to get your affection. That's a mark of weakness on the part of a guy. But there is a legitimate pity that we ought to feel for those who suffer, and suffer undeservedly. If it's been a good person who's done a lot of good things, and then things happen to him, their financial fortunes change. I know of a man who made a lot of money, and when he made a lot of money, he was extremely generous. I mean, went way beyond, above and beyond, to help people in need. And I saw it, though he never promoted it. I knew about it. And he never wanted anybody to know. And then a business partner betrayed him and left him high and dry, and cut off a major source of income for him. And you see that, you pity it, because you think that could happen to you as well. And so that's something that we feel. Now, we feel pity when we remember that similar misfortunes have happened to us or ours, or we expect them to happen in the future. Now, you are able to feel more pity if you've gone through something similar. That's why when somebody is really sick, what is typically our response? Oh yeah, I had something like that too. And what we're saying is, I can really relate to that. Yeah, man, that's painful. Up until a few years ago, I never really had any pity for a person who had a kidney stone, and then I had one. And after I had my kidney stone, oh man, life changed for me. And for one thing, I was a heavy, avid Coke drinker. And then after I had my kidney stone, I swore off Coke for the most part, because I never want to have that again. Anytime somebody says, oh yeah, I had a kidney stone, I immediately feel their pain. I'm able to pity them, because not only did I experience it in the past, but I imagine that I could experience it again in the future. Now, we're all this way with the things that we've gone through ourselves. And so if you think that this is a very imminent threat or reality, yeah, maybe you're a person who sometimes you have a hard time staying focused in school, or sometimes you push the envelope a little bit, and then you see one of your friends do something that you've done a few times, and they get busted for it. And you're thinking, oh man, that could be me. You feel pity for that person, okay? We feel pity towards those whom we know though not those closely related to us. You're more likely to feel pity towards a friend than you are towards a brother or sister. Because with brothers and sisters, it's a little complicated with that. It takes more for you to feel pity for them. That's why a mother who is a teacher might be a little more sympathetic and compassionate towards a student than towards her own child with that, because the mother probably expects her child to be a little bit tougher, but doesn't know the expectation for the child. All right. We feel pity also towards people who are like us, especially the innocent who are experiencing painful or destructive evils. So we feel that pity on their behalf with that. Now, the opposite of pity is indignation. Indignation is pain caused by the sight of undeserved good fortune. Okay, so get the difference here. Pity is pain felt by the sight of some undeserved pain. Okay, destructive evil. Indignation is caused by the sight of undeserved good fortune. So you're looking at them. Now, you are more likely to feel indignation about a sibling than you are pity. Okay? Because with our siblings, we know them too well. We know all their faults, and living with each other creates a magnifying glass for those things. So when you look at it, it's easy. I'm not saying that this is universally true, but it's easier for us to feel indignant when they are rewarded for things and we're thinking, they don't know about this or that. The same thing with rivals. A rival, we are much more likely to feel indignation than we are to feel pity. We feel indignant if we think that we ourselves deserve a thing and that others do not. Now, this is the case. The awards are handed out at the end of the year, and maybe there's a Christian character award, and it's given to your rival. Oh, man. You're likely to feel indignation at that point. If all the people that they could have given it to, how could they give it to him? Right? Because we know him, and we know what kind of a jerk he is, right? So we feel indignation. We're indignant with those who get what is not appropriate for them, or with those who set themselves up against their superiors. I remember a few years ago, there was a college football coach, very successful right away. Every program he went to, I think he started at Bowling Green, and then he went to the University of Utah, and then he ended up at, I think he was at Ohio State for a while, and then the University of Florida. And at every level on the college level, college football, Urban Meyer, he was successful, extremely successful. And I think when he got to Ohio State, I heard somebody say, someone here in Utah, because he had left the University of Utah, and they said, I hope he doesn't win a championship. It's too early. He's too young. It'll spoil him. Now that sounds a lot like indignation right there. That you just believe that it is not appropriate for him, like he hasn't paid his dues yet. And that's an idea that people have. Sometimes you see it with politics. A guy runs for elected office, and he's never run for elected office before, and instead of starting down at the bottom like the dog catcher or something like that, he starts off running for Congress, and he wins. And we just feel indignant about that. Like, who is this guy? And we don't even know him. We don't know how he'll vote. That's how indignation works. Okay, then we come to envy. Envy is pain at the sight of good fortune. We feel it towards our equals, not with the idea of getting something for ourselves, but because the other people have it. Envy is a bad feeling felt by bad persons. I'm going to come back to that because I don't want to get interrupted on this video.